It's okay, darling. I've got the horn. Hello and welcome back to Tweed's Garage for the third instalment of Trials and Tribulations of Vintage Car Ownership. So I left you describing how I was building the block up, and it has carried on. So the first thing to do was get the crank back in, the cams back in, install the timing gears, the intermediate timing gear, and then time them up going by the marks on the gears. So lining up the dots at the bottom for the crankshaft, and then the I for inlet and the R for R or E for exhaust. Yeah, which is simple enough to do, and then button it all down, and then I flipped the block over and installed the rest of the oil feed pipe work and the oil pickup, pressure relief valve, and then the feed for the oil pressure gauge, and also the pipe work to take oil up to the top of the engine to feed the rockers up at the top. So with that done, I took my balance assemblies and installed the rods, and you install them from the bottom of the engine because the big end cap at the end is too big to go through the bore of the cylinders, so you feed them up from underneath. Bit of a fiddle on your own because they're a long stroke and quite a deep block, and on cylinder 1 and 2 there's a tube that runs below the bores for the engine mounting bar that goes through the engine, so it just makes it a bit tighter up there. So what I used was a magnet on a stick, and held the rod at the bottom of the engine and fed the magnet down, caught the top of the rod and just guided it up through the bore, and then let it rest with the engine on its side, and then proceeded to assemble the gudgeon pin and piston on each of the rods, and then feed the pistons back down into the bores. I could have used piston ring compressors, but I've done it the old-fashioned way with using them in nails and fingers and just feeling each ring down through the bore. The compressors are okay; they're fine. They work really well, but they're quite small pistons, and I didn't want to sort of catch the rings as I went down through. So I'd rather just do it by feel and fingers and just gently get them in and push them down one at a time, next ring, and down they go. And that was okay. They all went down really easy, apart from the one I videoed at the end, and I shortened this bit down because it just took me ages fiddling around with it, but they went in the end. I like to do that just so I know that the rings are in the gaps in the rings are in the correct orientation to each other. They don't slip round in the spring ring compressor as you're knocking them down. Then it was a case of flipping the block over, which was easy in the engine stand, and install the rod caps for each cylinder with new nuts and new split pins. Once they were torqued down, put the split pins in, checked that it all rotated okay, and that was all buttoned up. Then it was spin the engine back round again and install the new studs. They all went in okay. They were a bit tight, so I put them on the lathe and just chased the threads out a touch just to ease them up, because they were just too tight, and I didn't want to jam them in there. So what I'd done was run the lathe across them with the threading tool, and then as it got towards the end each time, just brought the tool out, so there would have been a slight taper in the thread. So yeah, they were a fairly snug fit to start off with, and then when you got to the last 1.5 threads, they tightened down nicely, so you get that extra bit of a seal along with Loctite as well to stop any water coming up through. Then it was on with the cylinder head, and I turned up some washers to go under the head nuts, because it didn't have any. Whether it did it originally, I don't know. I can't remember looking at the book whether it did or not, but I just wasn't happy with winding nuts down without a washer into cast iron. So yeah, I turned some load bearing washers up to go under the nuts so they torque down nice and evenly. And then the last thing to do was drop on the rocker assemblies on the top, gave them a bit of a clean. Yeah, they're a bit scabby around the water inlet where it's sort of corroded. It's just cosmetic really, it's just a bit of pitting. I did think about welding them up, but after having experience of welding the aluminium on the inlet manifold on the heat tube side, yeah, it was horrible to weld. It wasn't very nice, so I don't know what rubbish was in the aluminium, so I didn't even attempt it. So I've left them as they are. You know, it's part of the history of the car, and it's cosmetic rather than causing any issues. So just buff them up a bit and pop them on. Yeah, so they're ready to be tightened down and then do all the clearances, but I'll do that when once that's in the car and it's easier to turn over. I'll sort them out. So then if you've seen my other video on moving these machines in, I had to clear some space. So as the block was ready, I took it off the engine stand. What I did was I was just going to sort of gently place it on some wood on the sump, but it's an aluminium sump, and also it's not flat on the bottom. It looks like it's flat on the bottom, but it sort of raises up at the front a little bit, and then from the mid sort of the third, it sort of goes up at a gentle angle. And also on one side you've got the oil drain plate and the bolts as well that go through, so it would have made it wobbly. So what I made was a little wooden frame that I put a few screws down through the holes for the oil pan and just screwed it to the bottom of the block. And then with help of my neighbour and his son, we lifted the engine off of the stand and then manhandled it into the garage in front of the car, so it's ready to, when I get round to it, ready to hoist back up and then drop in just like that. Yeah, so other jobs that have been done whilst I was there was the starter motor. It was working fine, but I just gave it a strip down and a clean. Cleaned the commutator on it, checked the brushes were okay, and just greased up the bearings and cleaned up the Bendix on it, and then all greased it this end as well, because sort of unusually for an electric motor of this period, it's a blind housing at the back. Normally they have a little oil hole in them or something, or a little grease nipple, so you can just grease up the back of the shaft. So yeah, so that's all greased up for another few years, and just a gentle paint job so it doesn't look too over restored. It had been painted before, and numerous times anyway, so we weren't keeping any original paintwork. And then the other thing that I had a go at was the horn, which was okay again, but it had been, the paint was all peeling off inside the horn tube, and what had happened, where it had been painted a few times, I don't know if you can see, there's a little drain hole at the bottom of the horn housing, so obviously any water that goes down there can run out. But where it had been painted a few times with thick old paint, that was blocked up. And when I took it apart, as you can see, there's an aluminium disc at the end. That had all corroded away. It had gone sort of all furry and crumbled away. So I emptied out a load of rubbish out of it, and and then from a piece of aluminium plate, cut out a disc to the same diameter. It was a little bit thinner than the the original plate by about quarter of a millimetre, not a lot, but it would be better than what was there. So put it in the lathe, turn a slight taper on it to match the original one, and it's a sort of just a backing restrictor plate for the diaphragm. I think it just stops the diaphragm deforming too much. You know, it's got that slight shape to the back of it so that the diaphragm forms around it. And the other thing I found, on the sort of operating plate above the solenoid, there's a little finger sort of contact riveted to the plate, that when the horn operates, it comes down and it breaks the contacts. I've done you a little diagram. So here we go. So this is your coil with your power coming in, positive and negative, and they come through a contact to energize the coil. So with the coil energized, this metal rod below the diaphragm gets attracted down, and as it comes down, this little finger comes down as well and breaks. As it comes down, it breaks the contact, breaks the current, releases the rod back up, and because it's attached to the diaphragm, it moves the diaphragm down and then back up again. As soon as it goes back up and the contacts make again, power goes back through it and it pulls it back down again, and then breaks and goes back up again. But it does it very quickly, and you get resonance, and then that is the noise of your horn. It's just this diaphragm vibrating in and out. Clever, eh? So with the plate made and the little finger contact re-riveted to the horn, it was a case of giving it a paint and reassembling it, and yeah, so that's ready to go back on as well. So that's where we are now. So the engine's waiting to go back in, along with the gearbox and numerous other pieces. So when I've got a clear bit of time and put my mind to it, hopefully it shouldn't take too long. I can't leave it much longer, so otherwise I forget where all the nuts and bolts go. And then finally get round to repairing that leak on the radiator. So until the next update, see you again.